Last week, the lesson was, what's with all the boasting? I brought out last week, most of us find things to brag about. There's usually something. Sometimes I think I'm not great at anything. I really beat myself up a lot. You see me stand up here with a loud voice and you think, boy, he's cocky and arrogant. There's a lot of areas I'm really insecure. There's areas I think, my God, what's going on here? And I think there are days I think, how can you love me? I never did follow through on that, but I said I was going to write a song one day and singing to the Lord, Lord, how could you love me so much when I don't even like myself? How many of you have days like that? So it's human nature in half the population. Half the population are insecure. Half the population is extroverts and introverts. Half the population are introverts. The other half are extroverts. So half of us from time to time think that, wow, how could God possibly love me? And the other half wrestles with the opposite extreme. God, you really got a hold of something when you got me. So they're the two extremes. Somewhere in the middle is that place where we want to land. But I find places, as insecure as I can be, I find things to brag about. Now, you know, there's good bragging. I mean, it's good to brag about the Lord. The Bible said if you're going to boast, boast about the Lord. But there are people, you can never get around them without them telling you how much money they got, how nice their new car is, how they're going to go on a cruise, how they're going to maybe sell their $300,000 house and buy a $400,000 house. And I thought that's wonderful. What else is going on? You know, there are just people that always have to let you know they got it better than you. The bottom line is, the person in the $300,000 house that's moving up to a $400,000 house needs to realize there are a bunch of people with $500,000 houses and $600,000 houses and $1 million houses and mansions beyond those prices were thrown out there. So it's easy to brag, and you know, two things that are easy: brag and complain. And you know, I always tell people tell me if I won a lottery I'd build you a brand new church. I thought, no, to myself, I don't tell them that. No, you won't. Givers give all the time. If you're not giving now, you're not going to give if you win the lottery. That's just the bottom line. Givers are givers, and non-givers are non-givers. And just the way life works. But when we complain about not having much, so we win $150 million and think, man, we got it made now. And we move out to Regency in $1 million house surrounded by $2 million houses. And so we're complaining again. How come they all got nicer houses than me? How many of you know that's human nature? Complaining and bragging. If we're not doing one, we're probably doing the other. But anyway, Paul could not understand the boasting thing. Paul had this ideology that everything that's good comes from God. And if it comes from God, there's nothing for us to brag about. The reasonable reaction, if you think everything good that's happening in your life is a gift from God, then the reaction should be worship, thanksgiving, not boasting. Paul went so far one time as to say, why does some of you, in his first letter to the Corinthians, act like those things you have you didn't receive? He's saying, they were a gift from God. Why are you getting cocky about it? And if you know you did receive it, then what's with the attitude? That's what Paul said. He doesn't get the boasting thing. He doesn't get it. But he's being forced in chapter 11 to do boasting, but he won't boast the way other people boast. He finds a creative new way to boast. All right? So last week we talked about what's with all the boasting. I put down there in the easy to read version, Romans 3:27. So do we have anything to brag about? Bragging has been eliminated. On what basis was it eliminated? On the basis of our own efforts? No, indeed. Rather, it is eliminated on the basis of faith. In other words, everything you got from God. And so you bragging, Paul said, has been eliminated. There's no room in the Christian to boast about how much nicer their stuff is than somebody else's stuff. All right. So, Paul tells us down in verse 18, since it's common for people to brag, I'll do it too. Verse 19, for you suffer fools gladly, seeing you yourselves are wise. So he's telling them, in essence, I realize that these false teachers have got you feeling so arrogant about your holiness. You're keeping some rules and now you think you're holy. You're so arrogant about your holiness that you're thinking, I'm up here. And, legalism only has two potentials, folks. Now, what does Brother Hannah mean when he says legalism? There are two categories of false doctrine in the American church today and in the churches that Paul wrote to in the first century. One category is legalism, the other category is license. Legalism means that I can earn it. I'll keep the rules. I'll do all the right things, and I'm worthy of it. My efforts make me worthy. That's legalism. In Paul's day, it was them trying to drag the non-Jewish Christians under the law of Moses, make them keep all the laws of the Old Testament. In today's world, there are a few of those that still insist we keep the law of Moses in American churches, but most just make up other rules and say, if we're not doing these things, we're not holy. That's legalism. The other is license, where a lot of our churches just think you're hunky-dory just the way you are. You don't need to change at all. They just want to pinch your cheek and say you're so good. And God's never been mad at you because you're a good person. I thought, which Bible have they read? The Bible tells me that I was hopelessly lost with no way to help myself. No way. And that's what the crucifixion's about. That Christmas song I wrote, is this okay? The Christmas song I wrote, God knew we were helpless and there was nothing we could do. So he wrapped up Jesus in some swaddling clothes as a gift for me and you. There was nothing we could do, so he gave us a present, and that present was Jesus, the sweet baby lying in a manger with his eyes on Calvary. Sent here to be crucified by his Father. You say, what father would send their child somewhere purposely to be crucified? A father that loves you so much, knowing that only by the shedding of blood is there remission of sins. We could not have, once you committed your first sin, there was no way for you to get to heaven. None. The first lie, the first unwarranted bragging, the first condemnation of someone else you thought you were better than. Once you committed that first sin, after the age of accountability, when you're old enough to know, you say, what is that? God knows. Above my pay grade. Once you committed that first sin, there was no way for you to get to heaven on your merit. None. Romans 5 tells us we were powerless to help ourselves. So Jesus, God so loved us, and Jesus was on the same page, said, Father, I'll go do it. I'll face your wrath for them. I'll take the blame for their sin and give them the credit for my obedience. And so now everyone who will come to God through Jesus has been made worthy of heaven. That's the gospel. Legalism, this idea that I can earn favor with God, it only has two potentials. Always remember this. Legalism only has two potentials. One, it makes you arrogant and proud, thinking I'm keeping all the rules, and you're hard to be around because you think you're better than all the other Christians. The other is it causes you to be constantly condemned because you keep failing to keep all the rules. At least the second one is more honest, because there ain't nobody keeping all the rules. Nobody. You don't keep all the rules in your car. Said speed limit 40. How many of you figure that means 45? How many of you figure it means 50? 55. I'm a good, honest person. I keep the rules, really. The Bible tells me to keep the rules of the land, obey the laws of the land. When we're on a trip, this is how righteous I am. When we're on a trip and we're in a freeway going 70, I set my cruise at 74. I figure cops are too busy to bother me for 4 miles an hour. He sets his cruise at 79. I don't think the cops are that busy. But anyway, setting your cruise at 71 is against the law. If it's 70, setting your cruise at 71 is against the law. When I go on the freeway, I'm a sinner. The point I'm getting at, we get our pet rules, and we think if we keep those pet rules, we're pretty good. Last week's lesson was basically about you got none to brag about. You're just saved in spite of you by the grace and love of God. It's a gift to you. God wrapped it up in the person of Jesus. All right, now let's go on to this week. The bottom there, 2 Corinthians 11, starting with verse 21. When I was talking about how he said to them, in verse 19, you suffer fools gladly, seeing you're so wise. Verse 20 said, for you bear it if a man makes slaves of you. In the Greek, that's talking about brings you under the bondage of the law, of keeping all the rules, or preys upon you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. So, after saying that, after saying you suffer fools, so let me be foolish. These false teachers among you lord it over you. They act like they're all that. They treat you badly. So in verse 21 he said, I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whereinsoever any is bold, I speak foolishly, I am bold also. The New Living Translation said, I'm ashamed to say that we were not strong enough to do that. Strong enough to do what? What verse 20 said. The false teachers were treating them badly, and they thought, man, they must be really close to God. I need to suck up their treatment and glean what I can from them. And Paul said, Timothy and I, we weren't strong enough to treat you like that. But he did go on and say, all right, but whatever they dare to boast about, I'm talking like a fool, gang, I can boast about it too. So Paul sarcastically says that he and Timothy weren't strong enough to take advantage of the Corinthian Christians like the phony apostles did. Aren't you glad Jesus doesn't take advantage of you? Why we would take advantage of anyone is beyond the realm of common sense. So after being sarcastic there, he then turns around and gets serious. Though in his seriousness, he still declares that all boasting is foolish. But in that seriousness, he states that his pedigree, that his pedigree demonstrates that he is a true apostle is in a much stronger way than theirs does. He's saying, all right, they're boasting to you, they're apostles. Let's have at it. I'll show you in my boasting that I certainly have a stronger pedigree as an apostle than they do. Now, he's not talking about Peter and John. He's talking about these false teachers that he sarcastically calls your super apostles. And so he's not comparing himself to Peter and other men of God. He's comparing himself to false apostles. All right? So, he starts in verse 22. Are they Hebrews, these false teachers? Evidently they are. He wouldn't have brought it up. That means, in all likelihood, of the two errors, legalism, the Judaizers taught. Jewish preachers wanted to pull the Gentile believers, the non-Jewish believers, under the law of Moses. So the fact that he starts with this question tells us that's the error that he's dealing with here. The error of legalism. All right? So are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they of the seed of David or Abraham? So am I. Now it sounds like he asked the same question 3 different times. Israelites, Hebrews, children of Abraham. Abraham's the father of the entire Israeli race. It's his grandson's 12 children that became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. So it sounds like he's saying the same thing 3 times. The commentaries say there's a little different. Hebrews referring to the language and nationality. By nationality, they're Hebrews. Israelites to the theocracy and descent from Israel. In other words, Jehovah's their God. And the seed of Abraham to the claim to a share in the Messiah. So, to some, those names would mean a little bit a different angle of the same thing in each of those. However, the main thing he says, whatever they're claiming to be, I got it too. I'm a Hebrew, I'm an Israelite, I'm a child of Abraham, a descendant of Abraham. All right? So, why does Paul point to the apostles' claim of being Hebrews and so forth? Though these phonies were probably all these things, it didn't put them a leg up on Paul because he was all these things as well. So he starts with what they were. They were Hebrews, Israelites of the seed of Abraham. And he said, they got nothing on me there. That's all true about me as well. And then he gets a little more personal. Verse 23, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. He said ministers, remember, the word minister. In America, when you say someone's a minister, you think he stands behind a podium somewhere and talks to you on Sunday or Saturday. The word means servant. That's what the word means. Servant. Ministers aren't supposed to lord it over congregations. They're supposed to serve them by sharing the Word of God with them for their good. So Paul said, in essence, are they ministers of Christ or are they servants of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. And then he tells him what his service to Christ resulted in. As he served Christ, he said, in labors more abundant. He worked harder than any of those guys. Walked everywhere. I mean, walked miles upon miles. I'm sure he rode camels sometimes, or donkeys, but a lot of footwork, just constantly on the move. You look at the maps of his 3 missionary journeys, covered, of course he was on ships to get shortcuts across the sea at times, but covered lots of territory, more than any of the good 12 apostles, and more than any of these. He said the same thing in 1 Corinthians 15 about the good apostles. He said, I worked harder. What's he talking about? They were apostles to the Jews. Their journeys were shorter. Paul was an apostle to the non-Jews, constantly on the move. All right? So, he said, I labored more than all these false prophets here. In stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in death oft. Now, how do you often die? Well, here's what he talked about. See it in the easy-to-read version. Are they serving Christ? I'm serving him more. I'm crazy to talk like this. I have worked much harder than they have. I have been in prison more often. I have been hurt more in beatings. I have been near death many times. So Paul now, as you're flipping your page over, Paul now is telling people they claim they're ministers or servants of Christ. He said, I'm a bigger servant of Christ than they are. And he said he doesn't like to talk that way. He said, I'm speaking foolishly. I'm a minister of Christ more than they are, and here's why. I've worked harder. I've been thrown in prison more for my service to Christ, and I've been beaten up. All right, so, by the way, the title of the lesson today is, So You Think You Have It Rough. All right. So what does Paul do here? He goes from showing himself an equal in the previous verse, I'm a Hebrew, I'm an Israelite, and I'm of the seed of Abraham. He shows himself an equal to those teachers. And now he's showing his pedigree superior to them in this verse. So how did he do that? Worked much harder than they had. He'd been in prison more often than they had, been beaten more often than they have. His preaching the gospel had put him in jeopardy of death more often. So these aren't things we usually brag about. He refuses to brag about the revelation God gave him when he spent 2 years in the desert of Arabia after he got saved. He refuses to, he just mentioned it in passing one time, but he refuses to brag about, well, he'll get into it in the next chapter, about the fact that he was caught up to the third heaven one time. And he said, whether in the body or out, I don't know. And you say, what do you mean three heaven? Well, the first heaven, biblically speaking, is the atmosphere you and I live in. And the second heaven is outer space. And the third heaven is what you and I think of as heaven. And Paul was taken on a journey to heaven one time. He doesn't even know if he was out of the body, meaning a vision, or in the body, literally picked up and put there. He said, in the next chapter, I was given untold revelation. He doesn't brag about those things. He might tell you, he doesn't spend much time on it, but he doesn't brag about those things. So he feels a need to brag, to diffuse these false teachers. So what does he pick to brag about? The things he suffered in his service to Jesus. Doesn't brag about having a bigger paycheck. Doesn't brag about being better looking. Doesn't brag about his camel being better than their camel. His hut better than their hut, or whatever. He doesn't brag about stuff. He said, what I'm proud of is I was willing to serve Jesus no matter what happened to me as a result of it. You want me? You're forcing me to brag? That's what I'm going to brag about. All right? Verse 24. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. In other words, he was whipped. 5 times, 5 different times he received 39 stripes. He was scourged, the way Jesus was in Pilate's judgment hall. Now, we don't know what kind of whip they used. You know, they had the regular whips. And then they had the whips that had several tails at the end with things that would cut into the body attached to them. We don't know what ones they used. Paul didn't go into detail. But 5 different times he received 39 stripes from the Jews. Now, 3 times in the next verse, the Romans did it differently. Verse 25, thrice, that's 3 times, was I beaten with rods. Before we get on to the rest of that verse, rods, according to blogspot.com, consisted of a number of elm rods bound together with a thong into a bundle. Another comment by dynamicsofgrowth.com, a Christian website, the rods were usually made of birch wood, and the Roman soldiers would beat their victims mercilessly all over their entire body. The other frequent punishment that they would do sometimes is turn them upside down and beat the bottom of their feet until they broke the bones in the feet. But as I read about that, rods were so severe, the Jewish law of Moses limited a beating as punishment to 40 stripes. You had broken the law if you gave 41. So somewhere over the years, the Jews decided to limit it to 39, so if they accidentally miscounted, they wouldn't go over the 40. And that's why it became 40 stripes minus 1. And so they would beat them 39 times. The Romans had no limitation. They beat you till you were dead or they were worn out, one or the other. They just didn't care. And they would use a different instrument called rods. So, besides the things I already said, he had been whipped 5 times with the Jews. He had been beaten with rods 3 times. Now look at the rest of verse 25. Once was I stoned. Now a lot of people in America could say that today. But that's a different kind of stone. Well, no, a lot of people couldn't say it. A lot of people couldn't say once I was stoned. They would be a different number there. But he's talking about the kind of getting stoned when people pick up rocks and throw them at you. He said, once I was stoned, thrice. No. Imagine this. 3 times he was shipwrecked. In his missionary journeys, again, he often had to get on a ship of that day, which was nothing like the ships of our day, and cross the sea to say otherwise you had huge amounts of miles to walk around. And so he would get on ships often. 3 times, the Bible only tells us one of those stories in the book of Acts, but 3 different times he was shipwrecked in his service to the Lord. And one of those 3 times that he was shipwrecked, he said, a night and a day I have been in the deep. So after the ship went down, that means it either took him a 24-hour period to get to shore, or it meant it took him a 24-hour period to get rescued. Spent a night and a day in the deep. Now, I don't know about you. If I'm on a plane that goes down, I want it to crash and land. I want to be dead right now. I don't want it to crash in the ocean and me grab some piece of the plane that ripped apart on impact and hang there wondering if the sharks are going to come and eat me today or tomorrow. I have no desire to hang out in the sea. I can't think, when I read that a night and a day he was in the deep, I can't imagine, now maybe you have a better imagination, I can't imagine a lonelier place to be on this planet than hanging on a piece of wood in the middle of a sea or ocean. Boy, that would be lonely. Be the most lonely way to die I could imagine. All right. So, what do we find out here? He was beaten with rods 3 times, stoned 1 time, shipwrecked 3 times. One of those times he spent a night and a day in the water. Verse 26. In journeyings often. He was constantly walking from city to city, taking ships to the next city to get the gospel. He loved seaports. He loved to preach in seaports because people from, just like major metropolitan areas where they have the big airports, people from all over are coming into that area. So Paul often designed himself to go, I'm going to go there where caravans and everybody are merging. I'm going to have a bigger chance at reaching a wider group of people, and those are traveling people. If they receive the gospel, they're going to take that gospel to where they go. All right? So he said he was in journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers. Well, let's drop down to save time to the Good News Bible version. In my many travels, I have been in danger from floods. That's what the Greek means there when it's from water. He's not talking about the sea. That's a different thing. But that was an area the commentators say where flash floods could occur. So he said, in my many travels I have been in danger from floods, from robbers, in danger from my own people, the Jews, and from Gentiles, the non-Jews. There have been dangers in the city, dangers in the wilds, dangers on the high seas, and dangers from false friends. So see, he separates the seas from the waters, which means rivers in the Greek. So what do we learn here? He was in danger from flat floods, in danger from robbers, in danger from unbelieving Jews, in danger from unbelieving non-Jews or Gentiles. He was in danger in the cities when he preached. He was in danger in the great outdoors when he traveled, and on the high seas when on ship. He was in danger from false brethren. In other words, those who claimed to be Christians like him, but didn't like the fact that he was not preaching legalism, but grace. Grace offends the doer. Paul was the doer. That's not the kind of doer I'm talking about. The doer of works to find favor with God. The message of grace, that I have been made right with God because of what Jesus did, not because of anything I've ever done, offends those who want to do it themselves and want you to do it yourself. It offends them. It got Paul nearly killed often. All right? So, verse 27, and weariness and painfulness and watchings often and hunger and thirst and fasting. Well, let's go to God's the translation below. Because I've had to work so hard, I've often gone without sleep, been hungry and thirsty, gone without food and without proper clothes during cold weather. So again, he had to work so hard he often went sleepless. He sometimes went without food and water. He often went on voluntary fast besides the forced fast because he didn't have anything to eat. So there were times he was fasting simply because there was no food at his disposal, and other times he was fasting as a religious time of separating himself to God. And then he was cold because he didn't have enough warm clothing. You know, when our car died on we were coming up G at the stoplight on 16th there, and we crossed over. I gave it gas when the light turned green, and halfway across the car just died. And we coasted to the other side where everybody could get around us. And we sat there. We called Cliff, because Cliff's not doing nothing. He needs more to do. So we called Cliff, and we sat in the car waiting, and I thought, thank God this was today instead of last Monday. Yeah. That car would have been cold in a hurry. It was cooling down on a day like today. I have never, to my knowledge, I can't recollect a time when I've ever been outside where the weather was so cold, I was so inadequately dressed for it. Paul said, I've been there. I've been in situations in my traveling for Christ that the clothing I had was not sufficient to keep me warm. No, it's not as severe as being stoned, being beaten, but at the moment it probably feels just about as severe as anything. You're sitting there shivering, hoping you don't suddenly start feeling warm. If you're out in the cold shivering and you suddenly start feeling warm, that's a bad thing. When you're freezing to death, you think you warm up before you die because your body temperature is lowering. And because it's lowering, it's making you feel warmer because the contrast between the outside and you isn't as severe. Is that good science? Okay. I got a critic over here. I have to keep checking with him. All right. So Paul said, again, that he often didn't have enough warm clothing. And finally, verse 28, besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. The other translation I have there, besides these external matters, all the woes I have from traveling, I have the daily pressure of my anxiety upon all the churches. That's literally what it's saying in the Greek. Paul is saying, all these churches that I've started around the world, he said, I worry about them all the time. Are they being persecuted? Are they hanging in there? Are they giving up? Are they buying into a false doctrine? Or are they staying true to the gospel? He said, this is a daily anxiety. So, I put, what do we learn here? Paul was not some superhuman man. He was flesh and blood like you and me. In a day where there was no 24/7 news, Paul couldn't check on those churches by seeing going on one of the news networks and seeing if anything bad was happening there. He couldn't check on them. No cell phones. Can you imagine? No text. No way to text them. How you guys doing? No instant messaging. No Facebook. No Twitter. Why did God ever let anyone live in that day? He had no way. He worried about all these churches, all these people he led to Christ, that he fathered in the faith, and he had no way of knowing what's going on with them. They would write him a letter. Some church would write him. Sometimes when Paul wrote them, he was answering letters they had sent to him. But you know, the mail, they hadn't even got to the Pony Express stage yet. Somebody in that church had to start walking and figure out where Paul was. They had to walk someplace, and they had to tell him, well, I heard he's over there. They had to walk a long journey over there, and they say, no, he left here. I think he's going there, until they caught up with him. And then Paul would write them a letter. Many of them turned into epistles that we have in the Bible. And that same person would make the journey. At least when he went back, he knew where he was going. That's the only communication. The scripture in the Greek is saying, it makes me anxious. I don't know what's going on in those churches. I love those people, and I have no way of knowing. Time of persecution, all sorts of stuff going on. I don't know how they're doing. He said, upon all these physical things, they didn't happen every day. That big list of 20 things I put down there with the dots, they didn't happen every single day. There were good days. Nobody was throwing rocks at them. Nobody was beating them. But even on those good days, you have the weight of these churches. So you say we shouldn't ever let anxiety get to us. We're flesh and blood. It got to Paul. But Paul wasn't worried about losing money. Wasn't worried about losing his health. He was worried about the people he loved. And no way to touch base with them. So I read this area of Scripture and I think, self, tell me. You ever talk to yourself? Self, tell me. You think you got it bad? I had to sit 10 minutes till Cliff got off his duff and got down there and give us a ride. I think I got it bad. Sitting 10 minutes. Where's Paul have that here? I don't see that. We complain about things, and Paul said, you want me to brag? I'm not going to brag about how many converts I have. You know, there's nowhere in here where Paul ever tells anyone how many converts he's won. He just keeps preaching the gospel. Yeah. And he said, if you're going to make me brag, I'm going to fool you. I'm going to brag about how much God allowed me to suffer for him. You know, Peter and John were beaten for preaching in public. You know how strange these people who gave us this to read were? They were literally beaten, whipped. They didn't go on their way and say, God, we're trying to work for you. Why are we going through this? You know what the Bible said? They went their way rejoicing that they had been counted worthy to suffer for him.